With the beginning of the Second World War, every Japanese citizen wondered how the battles of Imperial Japan were unfolding in the Pacific region. Commander Tadao Kuwahara, a reserve officer of the Japanese Navy, was also concerned about this situation, but Kuwahara had other more pleasant things to think about. He had returned to the sea as the captain of the ship Nita Maru, one of the luxurious cruise liners, only this time the ship's hull was camouflaged. More than a quarter of the passenger cabins had been removed, and the deck had become flat. Even the ship's name had been changed. Now it was called Chuyo. The former liner, with a displacement of 17,830 tons, left the Kure Naval Shipyard in November 1942 as an auxiliary aircraft carrier. On its deck were a large number of Army and Navy aircraft, including a dozen light twin-engine Type 99 bombers from the 208th Light Bomber Squadron, aircraft better known in Japan by their short name, Type 99 Sokei. The short February days of 1943 began to lengthen as Chuyo departed from Kure, heading for Truk Island in the Caroline Islands, the largest Japanese naval base outside the home islands and the headquarters of the Imperial Navy in the Central Pacific. It is worth noting that Truk was a naval territory, while the aircraft being delivered belonged to the Army and had a short operational range. So short, in fact, that an aircraft carrier was required to deliver them to the southern part of the empire. Clearly, they were not meant to end up at Truk, and this was well known, since the Imperial Navy was responsible for operations further south, near the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The transfer of Army aviation to the south could mean only one thing: trouble. The 208th Squadron was sent to assist the battle-worn 45th Squadron in Rabaul, the fleet's bastion in New Britain and the cornerstone of the defense of the Solomon Islands. Truk lay more than 435 miles north of Rabaul at the very edge of the bomber's flight range. The crews and technical personnel of the 208th Squadron were mentally very far from war. Until then, they had served as a training unit in Manchukuo and had suffered more from the dust and cold of their bases than from the Great Pacific War, which was unfolding so far away from them. And now they were finally becoming part of the broader battle. Due to a decision made at the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, the squadron suddenly found itself in Japan in early 1943. It was re-equipped with the latest aircraft, the Model 99 Sokei, and at the end of February was sent to Truk to join the 4th Air Army, with an assignment to Ambon and Rabaul. By that time, their comrades from the 45th Squadron had already mastered the new aircraft and headed south in early March. The 208th was not so lucky. Equipped with a new version of their familiar light bomber but lacking maintenance experience among the newly assigned personnel, their work progressed slowly. Yet, according to orders, by the end of April, the unit, regardless of its condition, was to depart for Rabaul by air. The light bomber, Type 99 Sokei, had been developed in the late 1930s to perform localized tactical missions over mainland China, as well as to support ground forces in a potential conflict with a powerful Western neighbor, the Soviet Union. When Japan occupied the 3 northern provinces of China in 1931 and created the puppet empire of Manchukuo, the Japanese Empire and the Soviet Union had already clashed several times, along hundreds of kilometers of their ambiguous shared border. For Japan and its army, the spread of communism in Asia and the Soviet Union itself posed a serious threat. From the beginning of the Sino-Japanese conflict in July 1937, the Japanese Army Air Force felt confident that it could face any opponent in the region. The Army had long relied on its tactical light bombers to support ground troops and strike enemy positions. This type of aviation was represented by numerous single-engine biplane light bombers, the Kawasaki 88 and 93. New monoplane designs had only just begun to enter service, such as those by Mitsubishi, followed soon by the more maneuverable Kawasaki models. Although most of the world condemned Japan's invasion of China, only the Soviet Union supported Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, not just with words but with action. Soviet aircraft soon appeared in China, and the high-speed SB bomber caused a real shock within the Japanese Air Force. It turned out to be as fast as the latest fighters that had just entered service. The SB completely outperformed the light bombers being built for the Japanese Army. Facing the prospect of a possible war with the Soviet Union, Japan's industry reacted quickly. By the end of 1937, the 2 main producers of light bombers, Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, were ordered to begin development of new twin-engine light bombers. Mitsubishi was practically a newcomer in this field and, already burdened with work on a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft project under chief designer Tomio Kubo, began to study a light bomber under a new designation. At Kawasaki, engineer Takeo Doi began work in January 1938, trying to adapt the design of a heavy fighter then under development into an experimental light bomber. For both competing companies, this represented a major challenge. Mitsubishi was already fully occupied with projects for the Imperial Navy, and soon withdrew from the competition before design work was completed. Kawasaki, meanwhile, faced difficulties with its heavy fighter program, which caused the new bomber project to be assigned lower priority, especially now that Mitsubishi had dropped out. Nevertheless, by July 1939, the project had materialized into a prototype, the first of 4 experimental models. Powered by 2 new 14-cylinder radial Nakajima engines rated at 990 horsepower, all 4 prototypes were soon delivered to the Army's Flight Test Division in Tachikawa, near Tokyo. To meet military requirements, the forward section of the new aircraft was designed with a smooth, rounded aerodynamic shape. The crew of 4 was housed there, with machine gun turrets installed in the front, rear, and lower positions, all retractable, and an internal bomb bay located in the fuselage. To maintain proper weight balance, the tail section with its empennage was built as a long, slender boom. Ground testing showed that this construction was quite strong, but in flight, the aircraft behaved less favorably. During the prototype's first flight in September 1939, a dangerous issue appeared. The tail section vibrated and oscillated, though the rest of the aircraft performed well. From September through November, all 4 prototypes were modified to strengthen the tail assembly and eliminate the vibration. After successful flight tests, 5 new prototypes were built to serve as production standards. In the final version, the rear fuselage was reinforced, and the horizontal stabilizer was raised by 13.7 inches compared to the prototype. The same modification was later introduced into the related heavy fighter project. Late November 1939, the type entered series production under the name Two-Engine Light Bomber Type 99. It was officially accepted into service with the Japanese Army Air Forces on the 11th of May 1940. At the height of its career, and even after the bomber became obsolete and left frontline service, it was used for a wide range of tactical and experimental roles. One of the first modifications was an Army experimental multi-role escort fighter, later designated Ki-81. It was conceived in early 1942 as a heavily armed escort for standard bombers. However, the fighter proved too bulky and too slow. Various armament options were considered for the 4 prototypes built, from 5 machine guns of caliber 0.30 inches and 0.50 inches to a single 20mm cannon mounted in a power-rotating turret driven by electric or hydraulic systems. The aircraft was developed at the 3rd Aviation Technical Laboratory in Tachikawa under the supervision of Major Masaki. Turrets proved unreliable, and the project was closed after testing in 1943. A more ambitious project began in October 1944, when the 1st Army Arsenal was tasked with converting various Japanese bombers into assault aircraft for special kamikaze attacks. Crew size was reduced to 2. A single naval bomb weighing 1,764 pounds was installed inside the fuselage. A striker rod for the impact fuse ran from the nose into the bomb. The navigator's position in the nose was removed and the glazing was covered over with plywood sheets. The prototype was handed over to the Army Testing Department. On the 12th of November 1944, the Special Attack Bomber made its first flight, piloted by Major Hideo Sakamoto. In total, 3 prototypes were converted from standard bombers, and plans were drawn up to equip special kamikaze units of the Japanese Army Air Forces with such aircraft. The aircraft's reliability and low maintenance demands allowed it to be used as a testbed for Japan's jet aviation program. The first experimental Japanese jet engine was ready for flight trials in August 1943. The engine prototype was mounted beneath the bomb bay near the center of gravity. Flight trials in September were successful. However, the engine's thrust was too low for practical use. Still, the tests stimulated further development of more powerful turbojet engines, and later an axial turbojet with a thrust of 705 pounds was completed in August 1944, when Kawasaki won the contract to develop an experimental guided missile for the Army in July 1944. The aircraft Sokei was chosen as the carrier for that missile. In total, 4 standard aircraft were modified to carry a missile weighing 1,650 pounds and were sent to testing. The modified aircraft were completed in July 1944, but tests were delayed until October while prototypes of the missile were awaited. The missile, intended to strike invasion ships, was fitted with a warhead weighing 660 pounds and was radio-controlled from the carrier aircraft. The rocket motor gave the missile a speed of 422 miles per hour, according to some reports, up to 528 miles per hour, and allowed launches from a distance of up to 31 miles, although because the missile was visually guided onto the target by a crew member of the carrier aircraft, the actual launch distance was unlikely to exceed 6 miles. The bombers were used to test 30 prototypes of the rocket and to determine the optimal launch parameters for guided missiles. The testing program was complex, the rockets were difficult to control and often went out of command. During more than half a year of trials, over 50 rockets were used before the tests were declared satisfactory in the spring of 1945. Strictly speaking, the aircraft was never intended as a combat carrier of these missiles, but only as a test platform. There is information that several such planes were prepared as training missile carriers. For combat use, specially modified strike aircraft were planned, yet despite the production of around 180 rockets, they were never put into operational service. One of the final aircraft variants under development was a project described as a single-seat, twin-engine light bomber. Due to the absence of reliable data, it can only be assumed that it was a plane designed for special attacks against the invasion fleet, one that never progressed beyond the design stage. During the 2.5 years of the aircraft's development, the global situation changed significantly. The course of the China incident had reached a stalemate by September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, beginning the war in Europe. Japan and Germany became allies and joined Italy in an alliance on the 27th of September 1940. In April 1941, Japan signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Though it was a fragile truce, Japan's Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka saw himself as a diplomatic genius who had eliminated the threat of war with the USSR by isolating China's allies. However, these international agreements placed Japan on a direct path of confrontation with the United Kingdom and consequently, at least in conflict with the United States and the Netherlands. Importantly, the world's attention turned to Europe, giving Japan a free hand in Asia. When the first production Ki-48 model Aya aircraft began rolling off the assembly lines in Gifu during the summer of 1940, the new light bomber was immediately delivered to the flight school in Hokuto to begin rapid crew training. By the autumn of the same year, the 45th Air Regiment, which had previously operated Ki-32 Type 98 light bombers, began rearming with the Ki-48 model Iya Type 99 and was sent back to northern China. With a normal flight range of 764 miles and a maximum speed of up to 300 miles per hour, the Type 99 Sokei brought new capabilities to the Japanese Army Air Force in China. The new light bombers Sokei soon began appearing across all sectors of the vast Chinese front and took part in anti-partisan operations. Combat experience led to modifications and improvements related to armament, and production seamlessly shifted to the upgraded Ki-48 model IB. Soon after, the 65th Light Bomber Regiment transitioned to the new aircraft, replacing its Ki-32s. The 82nd Independent Light Bomber Squadron and the 21st Independent Light Bomber Squadron added the Type 99 Sokei to their single-engine Ki-30 Type 97 aircraft. In 1941, the 75th Regiment also replaced its Ki-32s with the new bombers. All these units were retrained and redeployed to mainland China. Before 1941, deliveries of new bombers to the troops had increased, prompting additional training for the crews of the Type 99 Sokei bombers at the Mito Flight School and the Army Aviation Technical School in Tokorozawa. All newly formed Army units began receiving the Model 1A and Model 1B. The 208th Light Bomber Regiment was established in Manchuria in March 1941, and the 206th Regiment in Japan in June. The 16th Regiment replaced its Ki-30 aircraft, while the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment received new Ki-48s in August, changed its specialization, and was sent to southern Formosa. In October, the Ki-48 first appeared in Japan's colonies when the 90th Regiment, previously flying Ki-30s, was transferred to airfields in the northern part of French Indochina. By December 1, 1941, around 350 Ki-48 aircraft had been produced and were already deployed in all regions where the Japanese Army was active, as the Japanese press took an uncompromising stance regarding the real and anticipated threat from the Allied powers of America, the British Commonwealth, and the Dutch East Indies. Ordinary soldiers in the Japanese Army began to sense that something was coming. Tensions with the American-British-Dutch alliance were rising. The anticipation of combat grew alongside intensified training and the redeployment of several units to the south. The 75th Regiment was transferred to southern China and joined the 90th Regiment in French Indochina to participate in the Malayan invasion operation under the command of the 3rd Air Army. In the northwest, in southern Formosa, on the verge of the signal to begin the war, the 8th and 16th Regiments were prepared for the invasion of the Philippines as part of the 5th Air Army. Both air armies threw their Ki-48 Type 99 Sokei bombers into combat in the first week of the war. At a joint Army and Navy press conference in Iwakuni on November 16, 1941, final plans for the start of hostilities were approved. The forces of the 5th Air Army were assigned responsibility for operations in the northern Philippines up to the 16th parallel, while the 3rd Air Army was to lead the offensive across the entire Malay Peninsula, advancing south toward the British fortress in Singapore. Both attacks were scheduled to occur at dawn on December 8, 1941, Japan time, to coincide with the Imperial Navy's attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, American time. The Philippine campaign was expected to be difficult due to the overestimation of American and Filipino air power, but the invasion of Malaya was considered even more challenging because of the distances involved and the anticipated high readiness of British Commonwealth forces. The invasion of the Philippines began on a foggy morning of December 8th, when Japanese troops landed unopposed on the small island of Bataan, roughly halfway between Taiwan and the island of Luzon, and seized the airstrip. By December 10th, the Japanese had landed on Luzon, capturing the airfields at Apari and Vigan. Once the airfields were fully secured by December 14th, the first light bombers began landing at Apari, followed 2 days later by fighter units. The progress of Japanese ground forces moving swiftly southward now depended heavily on the air support operating from northern Luzon. In less than a week, the Japanese had almost completely destroyed the American air forces in the Philippines. Their bombers now operated without fear of enemy fighters, focusing entirely on ground targets. By the final week of December 1941, Japanese troops were already approaching Manila. Unexpectedly, the American and Philippine defensive forces began concentrating on the Bataan Peninsula, with General MacArthur's headquarters located on the fortified island of Corregidor. On December 29th, light bombers began free hunting missions over Bataan, striking roads and bridges to hinder the American retreat, while heavy bombers battered the enemy fortifications. The campaign appeared to be nearing its end, and part of the Japanese forces were redirected toward Rangoon. But nearly 5 months passed before the Japanese could finally relax after the final surrender of Allied forces in the Philippines. In Malaya, the same grim story repeated itself. After the landings on December 8th in southern Thailand and at Kota Bharu in northern Malaya, within a matter of days, Japanese light bombers were operating against enemy resistance. By January 1942, the British Air Force in Singapore had ceased to exist, and the fortress itself was under constant air attack. The Japanese were then free to turn their attention northward toward the tempting prizes of Rangoon and Burma. The attack on Rangoon began on December 23rd. Army bombers appeared over the port and the city, conducting several brutal raids that nearly demoralized the Anglo-Burmese forces, who could not recover from the shock for a long time. However, over the next 8 months, the Japanese air forces were almost completely wiped out in New Guinea, with their final withdrawal from the vast island occurring in June 1944. The Japanese held part of New Guinea stretched along the northern coast, while the Allies controlled the southern coast. Both sides were within fighter range of each other, with the border running along the Stanley Mountain Range between them. The Allies held an advantage with their new bombers, a wide early warning network, and an active fleet and ground forces, which, through a series of attacks, were slowly advancing across eastern New Guinea, moving closer and closer to the Japanese bases. the Japanese still maintained superiority in the training quality of their pilots and ground crews. These were the best of the best in the army, veterans of the Asian campaign, eager for battle. They soon got their chance because once the 4th Air Army was established at Wewak, Allied air raids began. Very soon, most of the Japanese Army aviation in New Guinea was destroyed right on the ground. According to the headquarters of the 4th Air Army in Tokyo, the Japanese lost around 700 aircraft in New Guinea. In human terms, this meant that entire units were wiped out before they could even take part in combat. In a desperate attempt to hold New Guinea at any cost, the command of the Japanese Army aviation kept throwing new units into the grinder. Thus, the units equipped with twin-engine bombers in the Wewak area were completely annihilated. The Army Command urgently demanded the transfer of new tactical bomber units, which were desperately needed to support the Japanese forces in New Guinea from China, Burma, Sumatra, and Japan itself. The 34th Light Bomber Squadron arrived from Thailand and Burma, the 75th from Sumatra, and by March 1944, when the 4th Air Army was evacuated from the Wewak area and transferred to Hollandia in western New Guinea, the 12th Squadron had been rearmed with light bombers and sent to Hollandia. New units in New Guinea received an improved model of the bomber under the code name Lily. First appearing in January 1943, this new model looked similar to the previous version but carried a significantly larger bomb load. In addition, it was equipped with air brakes for dive bombing, though crews often removed them to reduce weight. Because Allied fighters held complete air superiority, daytime operations became impossible, and the Lily bombers were used at night for harassment raids against Allied airfields. The next model was fitted with a 12.7mm machine gun instead of a 7.7mm gun in the rear turret, and 2 additional 7.7mm guns were mounted on each side of the glass nose. Other minor modifications resulted in several more variants, and by the time production ended in November 1944, a total of 1,408 second-type Lily bombers had been built. By then, an entirely obsolete aircraft. These bombers were more fortunate in China and Burma, where they remained fairly effective against British, American, and Chinese ground forces. Their main protection was the difficult terrain, which prevented the Allies from developing a wide network of airfields. Moreover, the Allied forces in the China-Burma-India theater remained smaller in number than the Japanese until the beginning of 1945. By December 1943, the Japanese Army Air Force had 750 aircraft in China, Indochina, and Taiwan. A year later, in December 1944, this number rose to 1,200, of which about 416 were Army bombers. Maintaining this strength was a difficult task as losses in Burma and China were high and constantly had to be replenished, while entire squadrons of the Japanese Army Air Force were transferred from the China-Burma front to New Guinea. In China, the 6th Assault, 16th and 90th Light Bomber Squadrons, operating the improved models, maintained constant pressure on Chinese bases. The cost of this pressure was high. During raids on Kunming between April 28 and December 22, 1943, the Japanese Army deployed 165 fighters and 121 bombers against the airfield, which also housed the American Flying Tigers. The Japanese claim that during these raids they destroyed 30 enemy bombers, probably destroyed 18 more and damaged 9. On September 20th, during another raid on the airfield, bombers flying without escort lost 18 out of 20 aircraft shot down. Once the Allies began a rapid increase in the number and quality of their air forces in China at the start of 45, Japanese light bomber units began to avoid combat and soon ceased their attacks altogether. In Burma and India, the balance of power shifted even faster. At the beginning of 1942, the Allies suffered heavy losses in Burma, allowing the Japanese to approach the border with India. In October 1942, Japanese light bombers managed to carry out an air raid on a base in the province of Assam. However, from the beginning of 1943, Japanese losses began to rise sharply. For example, on February 25, 1943, a group of 46 bombers flying without fighter escort was intercepted over the city of Dinjan in India by 32 American Curtiss P-40 fighters. 28 Japanese aircraft were shot down. Constant Allied raids on Japanese air bases in northern Burma forced the Japanese to abandon these facilities. By January 1944, after part of their air units were transferred to New Guinea, only about 277 aircraft remained in the Burma area. Among them, the main striking force consisted of the 8th and 35th Squadrons of light bombers, flying aircraft the Allies called Lily. Taking off from Thailand and refueling in Rangoon before jumping north to one of dozens of auxiliary airfields in Burma, the light bomber groups could strike across a wide front and return to their bases. Thus, raids against India, Burma, and southern China continued throughout 1944. The standard procedure was as follows. 2 or 3 bombers would take off at night to attack widely scattered targets. Even the bases of American heavy bombers B-29 Superfortress in the city of Kharagpur were raided on Christmas night of 1944 by 3 Japanese bombers, although all of them were shot down by patrolling British Beaufighter night fighters. Destroyed in New Guinea, pushed back in Burma, and barely holding on in southern China, the Lily light bomber squadrons were going through difficult times. The last battle in which these aircraft participated as part of organized forces was the defense of the Philippines. In July 1944, the Japanese command realized that an Allied invasion of the Philippines, or even of Japan itself, was only a matter of time. A defense plan for the Philippines and Formosa was developed under the name SHO-1, according to which the Army and Navy Air Forces were finally to act together under unified command. When in October 1944 it became clear that the Allied invasion fleet of the Philippines was already near, the SHO-1 operation plan was activated. The 2nd Air Group was reorganized into the 4th Air Army, one of the core elements of which consisted of the Lily light bomber squadrons stationed at Clark Field and Lipa airfields on the island of Luzon. On October 24, 1944, in the west, the Japanese Army Air Force began a series of 3 attacks against Allied invasion forces in Leyte Gulf. The Lily bombers of the 12th, 75th, and 208th Squadrons actively participated in these attacks. These units were formed from the remnants of groups evacuated from New Guinea and equipped with the latest aircraft modification. Their losses were enormous. The task assigned to them, to destroy the American invasion fleet, proved completely unrealistic. And by the end of the week, almost nothing remained of the 3 squadrons and around 50 bombers. Practically all aircraft were destroyed in the air and on the ground. In November, the 3rd Assault Squadron, armed with these bombers, was transferred to the Philippines from the Kuril Islands. And in December, the 6th Assault Squadron was redeployed from Borneo. Poorly armed bombers quickly became easy prey for Allied fighter pilots and ideal targets for American aces to increase their scores. By January 1945, Japanese Air Force units in the Philippines had been wiped out, and only kamikaze attacks still posed a threat. After the battles in the Philippines ended, aircraft of this model became a rare sight in the skies. Many of them were converted for kamikaze suicide attacks. A bomb weighing about 1,760 pounds was installed inside, or a pair of bombs were suspended externally, either 550 pounds each or 1,100 pounds each. These aircraft were used in attack during the defense of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, in April and May. The planes also took part in night raids on Allied airfields on Okinawa in late spring and summer of 1945. From time to time, they were used even in daytime missions, which were practically indistinguishable from direct suicide attacks. Some aircraft were kept in reserve on the Japanese island of Kyushu. They were intended for suicide missions against Allied transport ships once the invasion of Japan began. It was there that the occupation forces discovered them after the war ended. When the Japanese Empire collapsed, this type of bomber became one of the Japanese aircraft that entered service with foreign air forces. On the island of Java, the Japanese had left behind a large amount of aviation equipment. Most of the planes had turned into piles of scrap metal. However, Indonesian rebels fighting against the Dutch managed to assemble one working aircraft from several wrecked bombers. It became the first twin-engine bomber in the security forces of the Indonesian People's Army. This aircraft was used throughout the second half of the 1940s until it was replaced by more modern machines. In China, a large number of light bombers from 2 Japanese units fell into the hands of various sides of the conflict. The planes were handed over to the Chinese nationalists in Nanjing, Hankou, and Beijing, as well as to the Chinese communists in Manchuria and North Korea. The nationalists painted their own insignia on the captured bombers, but it seems they never used the former Japanese planes in combat. The air forces of the Chinese Communist Army, on the other hand, gladly accepted the new aircraft. They actively recruited former Japanese crews and technical personnel as mercenaries. The Communists also established flight schools in Harbin and Manchuria, where Japanese instructors began training Chinese pilots to fly their former machines. In the second half of the 1940s, the air forces of Communist China possessed several dozen such bombers. They became the main type of bomber in Mao Zedong's army. After the formation of the People's Liberation Army of China in July 1946, these aircraft remained in service during the Chinese Civil War. Their operation continued until the planes wore out completely and spare parts were no longer available.